All right, welcome back, everyone. We are so happy to have you joining us today for the live stream to benefit Hollywood Food Coalition here at Trek Talks, trektalks.net. I'll be your moderator for this panel that I have been looking forward to so much. This is part of the Creative Brain Trust who have brought you Star Trek over the years. We're joined by Brannon Braga, Andre Bormanis, Jeri Taylor, Bryan Fuller. Lolita Fatjo should be with us in a moment. We're doing some technical troubleshooting on that end, so she may pop in unannounced. But this is great. This is the kind of thing that I've been looking forward to doing all day long because we get to talk about what actually makes Star Trek Star Trek. Some of the people who have put those words on the page that then become the TV shows and movies that you enjoy. So, as I mentioned to all of you before we came into this room, we want to keep this light, conversational, fun. Feel free to take over from me at any point that you like. Oh, wait, I think we have Lolita.
Is it working now?
Yeah, we can hear you. Can you hear us? Wonderful. Welcome, Lolita. All
Hello,
right.
Mr. Braga.
Hello.
All right. So my first question to everybody here is, coming at Star Trek from a fan point of view, I'm curious how you look at this as a writer and saying, okay, is there a certain audience expectation when the name Star Trek is on something? And if that is the case, then how does your writing sort of mold to fit that expectation?
Well, I didn't come to it as a fan. I was what I call a Star Trek virgin. I had never seen any episode of any of the series, any of the movies, any of the animated series. I had seen nothing. I really had no idea what it was all about. So I had no expectations, and I was just thrown into the middle of it and had to go to Star Trek school and watch all the things that I had never watched and figure out what was going on. So I came in with no expectations or preconceptions at all.
Which I think is excellent. And that actually leads to another question about, maybe a very misplaced idea about Star Trek fans being people who should write Star Trek or create Star Trek, which I would definitely push back against. But I'm speaking, there are fans there who they see the name Star Trek on something and they have an expectation. But as writers, not coming at this necessarily as fans, you're tasked with the idea of creating something that fits into Star Trek. So, Jeri, you just said you went to Star Trek school. What did you take out of Star Trek school to then help guide you to creating more?
It was mostly a terrifying experience because I realized how vast and specific this universe was, this universe about which I knew absolutely nothing. So it was very intimidating. It was very frightening. My strength as a writer in my prior years and experience had been in writing people. And the first script that I wrote, which was a rewrite called Suddenly Human, very much focused on the human element, the characters. The second script that I wrote was not like that. It was much more technical. And I went to Rick Sternbach and Mike Okuda, our technical advisors, and they gave me all kinds of wonderful information. And I wrote the script and I gave it to Michael Piller. And he read it and he came back and he said, "You have fallen into the research well," meaning I had just focused only on the research and the technical aspects and it had no heart. And so Star Trek at its core is about people, and it has to have heart. And even scripts that are full of war and shooting and enemies and all that kind of thing have a very profoundly compassionate element to them.
I just have to say I was very honored. I worked for Jeri when she first came. I was her assistant. And I must say, every single night, she took home 3 tapes. They were VHS back there to watch of everything that had come before her. And on the weekend, she took 9 home. So she really just delved right in. And she had to, but she was amazing. So.
Wow. Well, let me throw that same concept at the rest of you. What did you take away from your own Star Trek school?
I think it's worth noting too that everyone here is only here because of Jeri. Jeri hired each and every one of us and nurtured each and every one of us. And I think I can speak for everybody in saying I know I wouldn't have a career without Jeri. And I think everyone would probably agree with me.
For sure.
Thank you.
It was a huge honor to be in the room with a pioneer, and just to be, this is something that Lolita and I spoke about. I don't think I would have gotten a job on a show that didn't have a female showrunner because I was this big queer, so like it took a woman to be comfortable with like this kind of big Viking homo in the room when in a time and place when it was really only straight guys and straight white guys that were being invited into play. And Brannon was a great shepherd, but Jeri was the one who hired me, and I would say that I owe a huge debt of gratitude to Jeri and Brannon, because I wouldn't have met Jeri if it weren't for Brannon.
Yeah.
And the first person I talked to about becoming, back then, 29 years ago, the science consultant for the franchise was Jeri Taylor. I was in graduate school in Washington, D.C., and through a long series of strange events, was suggested as a science consultant for Star Trek. And I didn't even know they had such a thing, but I was like, wow, I'm a big fan. I would love to talk about this. And so they put me on the phone with Jeri Taylor, and we just kind of hit it off on the phone. And then she invited me to come out to Los Angeles. And a month or two later, I had a science conference in Tucson, I think. And I drove to Los Angeles from there and, kind of hit it off, met Brannon and Lolita and Ira Stephen Bear and Renee Echevarria and just all of the amazing talent that, that had come together to make that, Star Trek: The Next Generation in its final season at that time. And, that's the word that I associate, I think, most strongly with Star Trek is the quality of the talent behind those shows.
Jeri, you found yourself surrounded by very young writers. But you were so supportive. I was an intern when Jeri came in, and she essentially forced Michael Piller to hire me, and probably kept me from getting fired more than once when I stumbled on a script. You were surrounded by a really young writing staff, Jeri. In retrospect, what patience you had.
I often thought of myself as sort of the Earth Mother of the contingents. Every one of the young writers on that staff was talented, creative, brilliant, competitive. And it was often, I felt like I had a room full of spitting cobras that I was trying to corral somehow.
And you were Ricky Ticky Tabby.
Right. But what bubbled out of all of that was their immense creativity and talent and their willingness to want to grow and to keep excelling themselves as writers. And when you have that kind of attitude, it's a very joyous situation.
Well, do you think that that's unique to the production style at Star Trek, that you had that particular kind of relationship, or was that something you found in other writing staffs on other shows?
I have never had an experience quite like the one at Star Trek. First of all, for the various reasons, there were a lot of young and inexperienced people on the staff for one reason or another. That is not often the case, and often, not always, but sometimes with writers who have a certain resume, they begin to think very well of themselves, and that can be a little more difficult to deal with.
Got it. I do want to ask about production and writing style, and I'm curious because everybody has their own sort of particular talents or interests that they bring to the scripts and the stories that they're working on. Did you find that your time for any and all of you, Next Gen into DS9 onto Voyager, are you particularly collaborative? Do you start out primarily writing by yourself, developing a story on your own until you feel like it's mostly fully baked? Just going, Bryan, starting with you.
Well, I came to Star Trek as a super fan, so I may be I believe Andre was also a super fan, but I came in with encyclopedic knowledge of everything that had come before because I had read the Encyclopedia of Star Trek. So,
no, but was that an advantage or a disadvantage? Did you hide that when you?
I was out and proud about all sorts of things, but that didn't necessarily mean I wasn't teased about it. And I think that it's interesting because, as Jeri said, when Jeri said, like, you know, I used to write about people and then I wrote about Star Trek and discovered Star Trek was writing about people. I think that's the key element. And I think that's when Star Trek really peaks, where you're like, oh my God, this is art, because it is talking about the human condition in a way that is philosophical and has an aspirational merit to it. So, that's kind of the lead with all Star Trek stories, is like, what is the human story happening, and all of the other stuff is ornamentation. If you don't have the human story, and that's, you know, there was one of the taglines for one of the Star Trek movies was "The human adventure continues." So I think that's the misnomer for a lot of people who look at Star Trek and they see science fiction first, but really none of that would work if it weren't for the people and the humanity at its core. And classic Star Trek was about friendship first. And I think so many of the Star Treks moving forward discovered that in course, that, oh, you know, whenever they lose track or they're finding their voice, it's all about getting back to what are the basics of the human stories that they're telling. And that's what Star Trek does best.
When I
don't know if that
was
answered your question.
first starting out as a writer, learning what it meant to be a writer, someone who was in the business and was very experienced said to me, just remember this: every story is at its core a love story. And I recalled that many, many times, because when you strip it down, the best stories are love stories. And I think Star Trek had many, many love stories.
Well, let's come back to this idea. As we brought it up before, and Bryan, you just brought it up again, this idea about fans creating Star Trek. And, you know, you hear this in fan circles. People say, well, you know, well, that person can't write it because they're not a fan. They don't get it. I always think back to Nick Meyer, who famously knew nothing about Star Trek and yet created some of the most beloved Star Trek movies. So it sounds like, and you all can kind of guide me here to this this correct place, which is that the skill needed to write good Star Trek is the skill of writing good, relatable characters. And Jeri, you just said it as a love story, as a relationship between those people. But it sounds like at a certain point, and that's where Andre comes in, you also put in spaceships and warp drive and phasers and aliens, and you get to provide that dressing for it, yes?
You have to remember, Michael Piller was not a Star Trek fan either. And there you go. I mean, all we can talk about is Michael as well as Jeri. If it weren't for Michael, we probably all wouldn't be here either. So,
No, I really felt that, you know, yes, all of the spaceships and the phasers and the transporter, all of that stuff, incredibly cool. And of course, as a kid watching the original series, that's what drew me in. But, you know, looking at it later as an adult and, you know, even watching it in reruns in high school and, you know, college, and even today, 55 some odd years later, watching the adventures of Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, that show would not have worked if it hadn't been for the chemistry between those three characters and those three actors, you know. And you see it really in even the most sort of by today's standards, kind of, laughable or regrettable episodes. It's still there. And I think I don't think any show has any kind of staying power unless there is that family at its core, right? And as Jeri said, it's those people love each other, and that's why we want them back in our living rooms every week.
The alchemy of Star Trek really is, and we doing 26 episodes a year, pretty much nonstop. We got 2 weeks off, literally. You can't fire on all cylinders every time, but the alchemy you always strive for is that the humanity that you're talking about and the science fiction parable. That's where the transporters and the warp drive getting you to weird places. It's that, what's the perfect Star Trek episode in my mind? It's the one that moves you emotionally, but also had some concept behind it that let you explore some topic or human condition in a way you hadn't seen before because of the science fiction. And that's what we always strove for. And I don't know what our batting average was, but but I think that episode you wrote, Suddenly Human, Jeri, that was a beautiful episode. And but there were a lot of good ones.
Well, let's talk about that batting average a little bit, because it's sort of always entertaining to me that you'll have fans who will, on the one hand say, oh, well, this is terrible, this script is awful, this person doesn't get Star Trek at all, or this movie, what a disaster, when they're still talking about the person who also cranked out some of their favorite Star Trek. I mean, I assume that you all get to walk away from it and go, hey, on average, my stuff is pretty great. I would hope. Yes, no.
I think even the worst episode of Star Trek is better than the best episodes of many other shows that have been on television. I guess because I'm getting old and getting nostalgic or something, I find myself watching MeTV and catching a rerun of Hogan's Heroes or Mannix or some Canon or some stupid show. Now, they're not stupid, but it's like, I look at even an episode of like the third season of the original series, which, had some kind of duds. Yeah. They were still really well written for the most part. The dialogue was interesting. It was intelligent. And in a way that most other shows at that time and maybe even today, we're not. So,
we also had the benefit, in the case of Next Generation, of someone like Patrick Stewart, who could make the worst dialogue sound like, masterful. Right. The actors and Kate Mulgrew, the shows were wonderfully cast. And at some point, you're kind of writing in the actor's voice once they've settled into the role, and it's somewhat symbiotic.
Well, I was going to ask you if you get into your head about that, if you're writing it on the page and you go, oh, God, Patrick Stewart's going to say this. I can't screw this up. Or do you just
you can't
trust?
Screw it up because Patrick is going to say it.
Right.
The flip side, yeah.
Right.
I remember
sorry.
I was just going to say, I remember the first time Patrick Stewart spoke some technobabble I'd inserted into his dialogue. There's a term called microfusion initiator. And I was so thrilled that he said that and the way he said it.
Excellent.
Well,
you were about to say, Bryan.
Oh, well, going back to the allegory that Brannon was bringing up, which is such a salient point for why Star Trek works. And even in the most preposterous circumstances, it works. And I go to the episode Tuvix, which is one of my favorites. And on paper, it has no business working. It sounds like a really bad idea, but it is so beautifully executed and performed that it's an episode that makes me cry. Tuvix didn't want to die. There's so much heart to even the craziest idea that you think like, oh, I read the TV guide log line and that sounds stupid. But then you watch it and you're having this moving human experience. And those speeches that Kate Mulgrew had about right to life were a perfect example of the allegory that Brannon is referencing, where you're thinking like, this is just isn't a silly science fiction show. This relates to so much about being human and making your choices, or having those choices made for you by somebody who doesn't really want to make them but has to. And I think that's when Star Trek is at its most beautiful.
By the way, Brian, you get bonus points today for using the word executed when describing Tuvix.
Well,
So, yeah. Sure, that wasn't subliminal at all, but well done.
That scene though, where Kate Mulgrew forces Tuvix into the transporter at gunpoint, I mean, that still sends chills down my spine.
It's great. It's
And-
great.
And to this day, there are memes, there are discussions on the internet. So it's still about that episode, however many years later, because it is such a fascinating. It's not one of those things where there is a definitively right or definitively wrong answer. It is,
which is always the best drama.
Yeah, exactly.
I wasn't on staff yet for that episode, and I'm curious. For Brannon and Jeri, did you think it was ridiculous, or did you think that we're gonna thread this needle and it's going to be very moving?
I don't think you ever go into, or I hope that we didn't go into any episode thinking it was ridiculous.
Right.
If so, we probably would have scrapped it and not proceeded with it. So you can't proceed through all the difficulty of creating a script if you don't believe in the premise. So no, I think we were committed to it from the beginning. If I remember correctly, which I can hardly remember anything. So Brannon.
Oh, it was as I recall, and it was a premise that was around for a long time before somebody, and I don't remember who, kind of cracked what it could be. It might have been Michael. It might have been you, Jeri.
From a Gaberman and Price pitch.
It was a pitch.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. But
Ken Biller, I think, wrote the teleplay, and he became fascinated by this idea of symbiogenesis, which he'd read about in a magazine article, and that was sort of the science fictional core of the idea.
So in our closing minutes here, we have a little bit of time left. I want to talk a bit about Roads Not Taken, and some of maybe the ideas, pitches, stories that you wish you had followed. Maybe you got pushed back and couldn't follow. I'm thinking of two things in particular. I mean, Brian, of course, your fingerprints very much in that first season of Star Trek Discovery. Then it becomes something else, and you probably had other ideas, other aspirations where if you had stayed with that show, what it would be. Brannon, I'm thinking about you and something that I had heard a long time ago in an interview describing your desire to have Seven of Nine sacrifice herself at the end of Voyager, that would be kind of the end of the road for her in a show of being very human. But obviously, this is also a very popular character. It wouldn't feel right to kill off in a series, but that's another road not taken. I'm curious if there are others, or if you have comments on any of those. Maybe if you had things to do differently. Yeah.
Typically, we didn't leave any story on the table. Stories were like mining for gold. They were very, very rare, hard to come by.
Very hard.
So usually if we had a halfway decent idea, we would develop it into something. But there were some, I think, and Jeri, I think we had a very preliminary discussion. There was a two-part episode of Voyager called Year of Hell. And there was a brief discussion about whether we would want to do a whole season where the ship was going through hell and falling apart and losing crew people. And though nowadays that's would seem like a no-brainer, back then, two-part episodes themselves were so rare, we had to say, to be continued. The audience was confused.
Right.
What's happening? It's ending? So we got that was shut down fairly quickly because you just didn't do that kind of thing. And plus Star Trek was kind of a, individual storyline, kind of beginning, middle, end allegorical show anyway. But that was one I remember.
I remember the Year of Hell conversation as well. Like, there were so many great points of continuing that story, and it would have been groundbreaking at the time. But like, Star Trek lived in syndication, so it was all about, the restart button, and how the fear was that television did not sustain stories over 26 episodes, much less 4. So it was a different time for television. I think now, if you were doing that season, absolutely the whole season would be a Year of Hell, because that's how we're telling stories now in TV. It's a completely it's evolved. But that was exciting. It was exciting to talk about. And there were so many great ideas about how to sustain that new dynamic with the crew. It was very exciting for the writing staff to be part of those conversations.
I know we've all talked about, they keep talking about 26 episodes, and that is crazy. It's just insane. I mean, from all of our different departments that we all worked in, that is an insane amount of work. And for you guys, like Brannon said, they left no story unturned. They had no choice. That's amazing. So,
and by the way, these episodes were shot in 7 days.
Right.
So once shooting began, which seemed to be all year round, you had to keep feeding the machine.
Right. The mall.
And I could never, not until I tried show running myself, did I really understand the insane pressure that Jeri and Michael were under. And why is Michael in a bad mood all the time? Well,
so let's talk about that versus creatively. I mean, producing 10 to 13 episodes a season now, which is the norm. Clearly, there's a difference in that approach to production, which may alleviate some of those concerns, some of that pressure. It comes with its own pressure and its own concerns. But creatively, do you have a preference? I mean, 26 episodes of Star Trek a season made for some great episodes of Star Trek. Now, 10 to 13 episodes a season also makes for some great episodes, but there's also a different expectation of the audience, that they're there for a season to tell one story. Mm-hmm. As creatives, as writers, producers, do you think there's a, significant pro or con to either way of doing it?
I like less. I think you could put all of your great ideas into less episodes and it moves like a rocket. I think there's certainly that range around episode 13 where everybody's like, oh my God, I'm so tired. And then for like 4 episodes, you feel people like, 3 Amigos, gonna make it. And then like around 18, they're like, oh shit, I love the show again. And it's exciting. And then here we go. So I think 13 episodes or less is ideal, just because you can fine tune them and you can have more fun with nuance. And there really is an opportunity to craft the production in a very specific way. Whereas at 26 episodes, you're kind of at the mercy of line producers who may just want to get it done and not necessarily put creative at the top of the priority list. So I think everything's better, smaller. Yeah, not everything. I'll take that back.
Another difference today, though, is the fact that a lot of these short-run series are based on novels, and the hard work of developing the story has been done, and they're basically taking every chapter of that novel and turning it into an episode. That's a different creative challenge, I think, than coming up with an original story for every episode. So there's pros and cons. I think.
The weird thing is, whether it's 26 or 8 episodes, it seems to take the same amount of time.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah, we only get paid for 8 episodes.
Well, listen, I am a fan of all of you, and I so appreciate your time. I could pick your brains all day long, but the interloper John Billingsley has dropped in.
I have the shittiest job.
You
I have to
do.
come in.
I have come to resent you so much
I know.
more than
This
usual.
is what denobulans do. We bust into a party at which we were not invited. We eat all the food. We make love to all the women, and then we leave.
Insufferable.
Why's it got to be just the women?
Well, you're right. I'm a denobulan. You're right. It doesn't have to be because the party won't last forever. Is my point.
But John, you're here to give us an update on the fundraising for Hofoco.
We are closing in on $21,000.
Oh, fantastic!
I can't
That's
thank
awesome.
you all enough for appearing today. I can't thank our fans and supporters. And for those of you who've already donated and feel like my job is done here, let me suggest one more thing that you could do. You could go to social media and you could shout out to the world. We still got 4 hours left. We have amazing guests coming up. Adam Nimoy's coming up. James Cromwell's coming up. John Delancey, Tony Todd, Rod Roddenberry, Jerry Ryan. So if you haven't gotten the word out, please share this with your friends. We'd love to see if we could get to, dare I say, $50,000 for the day. That would be an amazing achievement. And it means the world to our clients, and it means the world to the Hollywood Food Coalition.
By the way, John, I got an update,
Yes.
and I'm so happy. I just, we're not naming everybody, but my mom and dad just donated. So thank you, mom and dad, for doing that. Appreciate it.
Thank you, mom and dad. And I think of them as my mom and dad too. So thank you.
They love you.
And I love them.
Yeah.
I'm going to renew a promise I made earlier. For every $40 donation for the rest of the day, I will throw in an extra 10 clams to bring it up to $50.
Wow.
Okay. Let's see. Last thing. So we've been showing videos throughout the day. The next video will take you inside of our kitchen, and you'll meet a woman named Erin Lovelace, who came to LA to become an actress and has essentially taken over running our kitchen. And she's extraordinary. I can tell you that for anybody who gives their life over to working in the not-for-profit industry, they ain't doing it for the money. They're doing it because they have a heart bigger than